colonel said it loud enough for the whole motor pool to hear, which was the point. I am not handing a recon slot to someone who's going to need rescuing the first time a round cracks overhead. He was looking at the duty roster when he said it, not at her, and that was its own kind of insult. A man who wouldn't waste eye contact on the thing he was dismissing. The mechanics nearby found sudden interest in their wrenches. Nobody told him he was wrong. Stay with this one until the end, because what happened 3 weeks later in a dry riverbed outside Tal Afar made a believer out of a man who'd spent his whole career not believing. And do me a favor. Drop a comment with the town you're watching from. I like seeing how far these stories travel. Her name was Staff Sergeant Nadia Voss, and she had learned a long time ago that the worst thing she could do in a room full of men who'd already decided about her was to argue. Arguing confirmed the story they were telling. It made her the emotional one, the one who couldn't take it, the diversity hire with a chip on her shoulder, so she said nothing. She finished checking the optic on the rifle she'd been issued, set it down with the care of someone who treated equipment better than most people treated each other, and walked out of the motor pool into the white furnace of an Iraqi afternoon. She was 31, 5'7". She'd grown up in a town in eastern Kentucky that the coal had abandoned, raised by a grandfather who'd carried a Garand across 2 islands in the Pacific and never said a word about either one. What he did say, over and over, on cold mornings at the edge of a frostbitten field, while she steadied a borrowed .22 against a fence post, was this: the rifle doesn't care who's holding it. The wind doesn't care. The target doesn't care. Only people care, and people are usually wrong about what matters. He'd been dead 11 years now. She still heard him most days. The unit was a recon element attached to a forward operating base that didn't appear on any map a civilian would ever see. 8 men, and now her, which made 9, though the colonel, his name was Brunner, and he ran the place like a man personally offended by the existence of subordinates, had made it clear that 9 was a paperwork number and not an operational one. She was attached, she was not included. There is a difference, and everyone on that base understood it without anyone having to spell it out. The man who came closest to spelling it out anyway was a senior NCO named Ruiz, a thick-necked breacher with 4 arms like bridge cables and a habit of cleaning his nails with a fixed blade knife while he talked. He found her at the chow tent on her second night. "You shoot the perfect score they're all whispering about?" he asked. He didn't sit down. Sitting down would have implied something. "Not perfect," she said. "I pulled one low at 800, wind I should have caught." He studied her for a second, and something behind his eyes shifted by a single degree. Not respect. Respect was a long way off. But the start of attention, maybe. "Most people lie about that," he said, and walked away. She found out later, the way you find out everything on a small base, secondhand and slightly distorted, that Ruiz had told the others she didn't puff herself up. It wasn't much. But on a base where the official position was that she was a liability, the Army had stapled to their roster for a photo opportunity. It was the first thing anyone had said about her that wasn't an indictment. The narrator would like to note something here, because it matters to everything that follows. People believe courage is loud. They picture the man standing up in the meeting, slamming his palm on the table, making the speech. But the people who do the actual standing up when the moment comes are almost always the ones who were quiet beforehand. Quiet is not weakness waiting to be exposed. Sometimes quiet is a person conserving everything they have for the one moment that will require all of it. Voss was conserving. Brunner mistook the conservation for absence. It was the most expensive mistake of his career. The first 10 days were a slow-motion hazing dressed up as evaluation. They ran her through everything. Loaded marches in full kit through the worst heat of the day until her vision tunneled and the salt dried white on her uniform. Stress shoots where they'd have her sprint 100 meters and then put rounds on steel at 400 while her hands shook and her lungs screamed. Room-clearing drills in a plywood shoot house where the senior guys would deliberately crowd her, bump her muzzle, do everything they could to rattle her into a mistake they could write down. She made mistakes. Everyone does. She reloaded a half-second slow under fatigue. She flagged a corner once she should have cleared. They noted each one in a tone that suggested they'd been waiting for it. But she also did the thing on the rifle that none of them could do, and they knew it, and it sat between them like a stone none of them wanted to acknowledge. On the long gun, she was a different person. Slower heartbeat, steadier hands, a stillness that came over her the way it comes over a hunting animal. At 1,000 meters, with a crosswind that had 2 of their best shooters pulling their hair out. She put 5 rounds into a space you could cover with a dinner plate. The youngest guy on the team, a kid named Petrov, who couldn't have been more than 23, whistled low and said, "Okay, okay, that's not nothing." Ruiz didn't say anything, but he watched the whole string through his own optic. And afterward, he picked up her brass and handed it back to her, which on a recon team is closer to a marriage proposal than most people realize. The team leader was a senior sergeant named Hollis. Granite-faced, economical with words, the kind of man who'd clearly survived things he would never describe. He didn't haze her, and he didn't befriend her. He simply watched the way you'd watch a weld you weren't sure would hold. On day 11, after the 1,000-meter string, he walked over and looked at her targets for a long time. "You can shoot," he said, finally. "I'll give you that. Shooting paper isn't the same as shooting a man who's shooting back. You ever do that?" "No, Sergeant." "Then you don't know what you are yet." "Neither do I." He handed the target back, "But I've got a guess." That was the warmest thing anyone had said to her since Kentucky. What broke the standoff was not a test. Tests can be passed by performance, and Brunner had already decided that her performance was a trick, a fluke, a woman peaking under controlled conditions and certain to shatter under real ones. What broke it was the thing that always breaks these things. The plan fell apart. The mission was supposed to be simple. They're always supposed to be simple. A high-value facilitator, a man who moved money and weapons for the people putting bombs in the roads, was meeting contacts at a walled compound 40 minutes north. The recon element would set overwatch, and the assault force would take him. Brunner built the package, briefed it cold and precise, and at the end, when he assigned positions, he did not assign one to Voss. She stood at the back of the briefing tent, behind the last row of folding chairs, and listened to herself be left out of her own war. Hollis spoke up. He didn't raise his voice. "Sir, we need a dedicated long gun on the south approach. The terrain opens up there. If there's security shows, we'll want to reach out and touch it before it reaches us. You've got Petrov. Petrov's good. Voss is better." "Sir, you've seen the data." Brunner's jaw worked. "I've seen a range queen. I have not seen a soldier. She stays on the base. That's final. And then because cruelty has a way of needing the last word, when this goes sideways, and out here it always goes sideways, I am not going to be the one explaining to a grieving family why I sent someone who wasn't ready." Voss kept her face flat. It was a skill she'd built one humiliation at a time over a decade, and she was very good at it now. But the medic on the team, an older man named Boyd, who'd been quiet through the whole exchange, caught her on the way out and said something she would carry into the worst night of her life. "He's not wrong that it'll go sideways. He's wrong about you. When it does go sideways, and Voss, it will, you be ready. He'll have no choice but to see you then. Results are the only language a man like that speaks." The convoy rolled out at 0200. She stood on the gravel and watched the taillights swallow themselves in the dark and felt the specific acid loneliness of being the soldier left behind to guard the empty house. Boyd gave her a small nod from the lead truck. Hollis didn't look back, which she understood was its own message. Petrov, in the second vehicle, threw her a sloppy half-salute that was probably meant to be encouraging and only made it worse. She went to the operations center because no one had explicitly told her she couldn't, and she stood in the back corner watching the drone feed unspool in ghostly green. For 40 minutes, it was textbook. Overwatch reported in. The assault element stacked on the compound. The facilitator's vehicle arrived right on schedule. Brunner, hunched over the radio, allowed himself the smallest exhale, and then the green screen filled with men. They came out of a building the intelligence had marked as empty, and they came out of the tree line along the wadi. And there were not 8 of them or 15 of them, there were dozens, and they had the assault force in a bag before anyone understood what was happening. The radio turned into a single overlapping scream of voices. "Contact! Contact south, we're pinned. Boyd's hit. Boyd is hit." The drone feed showed the team's thermal signatures scattering, going to ground, and the cold white shapes of the enemy flowing around them like water finding the cracks in a dam. Brunner was a competent officer in that moment. The narrator will grant him that. He called for the quick reaction force. He worked the radio. He tried to pull a coherent picture out of the chaos. But the QRF was 40 minutes out, and the men in that wadi did not have 40 minutes. And everyone in that operations center knew it, and the knowing sat in the room like a smell. Voss stepped forward. "Sir, there's high ground east of the compound, 800 meters. From there, I can range the south approach and the wadi both. I can take pressure off them." Brunner didn't even turn around. Get out of my teak, Sergeant. Sir, they have wounded and no overwatch. I can. I said, get out. She didn't move. She looked at the screen, at the positions, at the geometry of the thing, at the way the eastern ridge dominated the entire kill box, and she felt the stillness come over her. The hunting animal stillness, the slow heart. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It had stopped asking, Colonel, they are going to die in the next 10 minutes. The QRF can't reach them. I can. You don't have to like it. You don't have to write me a commendation. But I am the only piece on this board that can change what's about to happen. And you know it, and if you stand there and let those men die because you'd rather be right about me, you are going to carry that for the rest of your life. The room had gone silent. Even the radio seemed to hold its breath. Brunner turned around. For a long moment, he looked at her, really looked maybe for the first time, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name, that he probably couldn't have named himself. It was a man recalculating his entire understanding of a situation under a clock that was running out. You have a vehicle and a driver, he said. Go. She was already moving. The driver was a nervous specialist named Kowalski, who drove like the devil, was in the back seat, which, in a manner of speaking, he was. The road north was a black ribbon under a sky thick with stars, and on the horizon the muzzle flashes flickered like a faulty bulb. Voss sat in the back with her rifle across her knees and checked it the way her grandfather had taught her by feel in the dark, and was distantly surprised to find her hands completely steady. She had spent her whole life waiting for them to shake at the moment that mattered. They didn't. The old man had been right. The wind doesn't care. Only people care, and people are usually wrong. 2 minutes, Kowalski said, and his voice cracked on it. You're doing fine, she told him, and meant it, and saw in the mirror that it helped. He skidded to a stop at the base of the ridge. She was out before the truck stopped rolling. The climb was loose shale and treacherous footing and a 40-pound load, and the steady, frantic music of a firefight she could now hear with her own ears instead of through a speaker. Halfway up, she went down hard on one knee, felt the rock open the skin, didn't feel the pain, kept climbing. At the top, she dropped prone, and the whole valley laid itself out below her in the green of her optic, and her grandfather's voice was in her ear, and she got to work. Through the scope, the team pinned behind a low mud wall, 4 signatures down or sheltering, the white shapes of fighters pouring fire from a building to the west and from positions in the wadi. She keyed the radio, Hollis, this is Voss. I'm set on the high ground east. Tell me what you need. A pause, then his voice ragged but level. Voss, west building, 2nd floor, the windows. They've got us ranged. Take it apart. She took it apart. The first shot felt like coming home. A man in a window, an AK winking muzzle flash, 800 meters in a quartering wind. She read off the dust and the smoke. She exhaled, found the gap between heartbeats, and pressed. The figure dropped. She rode the recoil back onto target, found the next window, pressed again. The fire from the west building stuttered and slackened, and over the radio she heard somebody, Petrov, she thought, yell, where's that coming from? Somebody's working. Keep it up, keep it up. She kept it up. She worked the building like a problem set, methodical, unhurried, the stillness holding. And then the trucks came in from the north, 3 of them, technicals with heavy guns in the beds, and they stopped just shy of the compound and disgorged men, and she understood in a cold flash that the wall behind which her team sheltered would not survive what those guns were about to do to it. She did not shoot the gunners. There were too many, and they were behind shields, and she'd never get them all in time. She shot the lead truck's fuel tank. 1 round carefully placed, and the night turned orange, and a fireball climbed into the dark and threw bodies in panic in every direction. The other 2 technicals scattered. The fire on her team broke for 3 precious seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Hollis got them moving. You hear that, whoever you are? Boyd's voice, weak, surprised, alive. I think God's a sniper. Negative, she said. Just a girl from Kentucky. And she was already finding her next target. What happened over the next 11 minutes, the after-action report would render in flat military prose. Enemy elements suppressed, casualties extracted, friendly forces displaced to alternate rally point. And none of that prose would carry the truth of it. The truth was a woman alone on a ridge in the dark, methodically dismantling an ambush that had been built to erase her team from the earth. The truth was Petrov, making it to the casualty collection point because she put 3 rounds through a doorway he never saw. The truth was Boyd, gutshot and gray, getting dragged the last 40 meters because she killed the 2 men who would have killed him first. They marked her position eventually. They always do. The fire started reaching for her, rounds cracking off the shale, and then an RPG screamed in and detonated against the back of the ridge, and the blast picked her up and threw her down the reverse slope like a doll. She came to rest 20 feet down with the wind knocked out of her, blood running into one eye, her left arm not answering when she called it. 2 ribs, she figured, maybe 3. A shoulder that had decided to relocate itself. She got up. The narrator wants to be honest about this, because it's the part people skip when they tell stories like this one. Getting up was not a triumphant moment scored to music. It was an ugly, gasping, half-conscious act of pure refusal, a woman on her hands and knees, vomiting from the concussion, and then climbing to her feet anyway, because the alternative was lying there while her team died, and that alternative did not exist for her. It had never existed for her. That was the whole thing about her that Brunner had failed to see. Some people are built around a center that will not yield, and you cannot find that center on a PT test or in a personnel file. You can only find it on a ridge at 3 in the morning when everything has gone to hell. She staggered back toward where Kowalski should have been with the truck. He wasn't there. The vehicle sat empty, driver's door hanging open, and a dark trail led away from it into the rocks. She keyed her radio with a hand that didn't want to work. Any element, this is Voss. My driver's gone. Blood trail leading east. I'm going after him. Hollis came back instantly. Negative, Voss. Get to a vehicle. We'll send recovery. By the time recovery gets here, he's dead. Sergeant, that's not your call. She turned the radio off. The narrator will not pretend this was the smart decision. It wasn't. It was the human one. Kowalski had driven her into the worst night of both their lives because she'd told him he was doing fine, and she was not going to leave him bleeding in a ditch in a country that would forget his name. She followed the blood. She found him 200 meters out in a dry wash, alive and dragging himself one-handed while 3 men stood over him deciding what to do with him. She had no scope worth using. The optic had cracked in the fall. So she did the thing she'd done as a girl with iron sights and a fence post. The thing her hands remembered better than her mind. 1, 2. The 3rd man got behind cover and put rounds in her direction, wild and panicked, and Kowalski, bless him, dying and game to the end, rolled over and emptied his pistol and put the man down himself. She reached him and saw the wound and knew it was bad. The kind of bad that a medic in a clean hospital fights and a woman alone in a wadi could only slow. She got her good arm into his harness and she dragged him, and her ruined ribs screamed, and her dead arm flopped, and she dragged him anyway, 50 meters, while more voices gathered in the dark behind her, drawn by the shooting. She got him into a low fold in the ground, and she put herself between him and the noise, and she counted her rounds. Not many. And she got ready to make the men in the dark pay the highest price she could charge for 2 American lives. Her grandfather, on a cold Kentucky morning a lifetime ago. Sometimes you can't win the fight, so you make it the most expensive thing they ever try to buy. They came careful, spread out, professionals. She dropped the first one into the dirt, and the rest went to cover, and the math got very simple and very bad. A dozen, maybe more. Her with a pistol and a count she could do on her fingers, and an unconscious man at her back. She made each round a sentence. She moved between shots so they couldn't fix her. A grenade landed close, and she threw it back without thinking, and it went off in the air and slammed her against the rock, and her ears filled with a high, steady tone, and her nose ran red. 7 rounds, 8 men still moving. And then the night came apart, with the sound of rotors and the long, tearing hammer of a minigun, and a helicopter dropped out of nowhere like the hand of something else merciful. And where there had been 8 men, there were suddenly none. The bird flared and settled in a hurricane of dust, and Hollis was out of it before it touched down, running low, and behind him Boyd on a litter and Petrov with his rifle up and the rest of them, alive, all of them somehow alive. Hollis got to her and took in the scene. The dead men, the dragged trail, Kowalski breathing in shallow gulps, Voss bleeding from a dozen places with 7 rounds left, and her chin up. He looked at it all for 1 second, and then he said, in a voice she'd remember the rest of her days, "Sergeant Voss, you are the most reckless soldier I have ever served with." A pause. "Get on the bird." That's an order, and it's the last one I'm going to phrase as a question. She got on the bird. Boyd worked on her on the flight back, even though he was the one who'd been gutshot, because that's what medics do. And between the things he was doing to her shoulder, he leaned close and said, "Dislocated. Couple ribs. Concussion. You should be dead about 4 times over tonight." A grimace that was almost a grin. "You're going to be a real pain to have around, you know that? Sorry to disappoint." "Don't be sorry." The guys took a vote. He cinched a strap and she saw stars, while they were bleeding out behind that wall, waiting for the QRF that wasn't coming, and then somebody on a hill started clearing the windows. They voted right there. You're in. Whatever Brunner says, you're bravo. She turned her face toward the open door so none of them would see what that did to her. Brunner was waiting on the pad when they landed. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 hours, which the narrator suspects he had. He watched them carry Boyd off and Kowalski, who would live, and then he watched Voss come off the bird under her own power because she would have crawled off it on her elbows before she let anyone carry her in front of that man. He should have had her up on charges, disobeying a direct order, abandoning a vehicle, going off mission, turning off her radio. By the book, it was a stack of violations that could have ended her career. They both knew it. They stood there on the pad in the rotor wash and the false dawn and looked at each other. And the narrator wants to observe that this was the real climax of the whole story, this wordless moment, more than any of the shooting. Because everything before it was a woman trying to be seen, and everything after it would be a woman who no longer needed to be, and the hinge between those two lives was the look on a hard man's face when he understands he was wrong about something that mattered. The report's going to say you maintained comms throughout, Brunner said at last. His voice was rough. It's going to say your actions were within mission parameters. It's going to say you displayed exceptional courage under fire. He stopped, swallowed. That last part's the only part that's true. Sir, I told JSOC you were a checkbox. I told my team you'd get them killed. He looked out at the mountains, going gold at their edges. Instead, you're the reason 8 of them came home. I have been doing this for 22 years, Sergeant, and I have made a lot of bad calls, and I am man enough to know that the worst one I ever made was about you, and I made it out loud, in front of my whole motor pool, because I was so sure. He turned back to her. I'm not sure of much right now, but I'm sure I owe you better than I gave you. He put out his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and so was hers, despite the shoulder, despite everything. You're on the piece and no asterisk, and the first time you pull a stunt like tonight again, I'm going to put you up for a medal and then I'm going to chew you out for an hour in that order. Are we clear? Crystal, sir. The narrator could end it there, and it would be a clean ending, the kind people like. But the truth of these things is never that clean, and it would be a disservice to her to pretend it was. She would deploy again. She would lose people. Not everyone comes home from every story, and the ones who don't leave a hole that the medals never fill. She would have nights for the rest of her life when the sound of a rotor or the smell of cordite or simply the dark of 3 a.m. would put her right back on that ridge, prone, slow-hearted, working the windows one by one. But she would also have this. A team that had voted her in while they were bleeding. A hard old colonel who'd had the rare decency to say I was wrong out loud in daylight where it cost him something. And a place, finally, that didn't ask her to prove she belonged in it, because the proving was over, settled in a riverbed outside Tal Afar on a night the official record would never quite capture. Weeks later, cleaning the long gun she'd carried up that ridge, she found herself thinking about the old man in Kentucky, the Garand, the frostbitten field, the borrowed .22 against the fence post. The rifle doesn't care who's holding it. He'd been telling her. She understood now that the world would spend its whole life trying to convince her that her hands were the wrong hands, and that the world would be wrong, and that the only answer to being underestimated was not to argue, was never to argue, but simply to be there, steady and unyielding, in the one moment when everything came apart and somebody had to hold. She set the rifle down. Outside, the base was waking up. Somewhere a helicopter spun up its rotors, and for once the sound didn't take her anywhere she didn't want to go. She'd come to this place, a name stapled to a roster, a checkbox, a problem to be managed. She was leaving it something else. Not because she'd been stronger than the men, or faster, or louder, but because when it all went to hell, she'd been the one who climbed the hill.